Hi everyone, this is Bridgette Adu-Wadier from Theogony, the student-run media organization, and I'm back here in the ACPS studio for another episode of Behind the Headlines, where we discuss hot topics impacting the city. We're here to discuss racial equity in the school division, the Virginia State Senate and House of Delegates elections, and the school board potentially reducing in size. With me, I have Michael Pope, who's a reporter for the Virginia Public Radio, Missy Schrodt, who writes for the Alexandria Times, and Vernon Miles, who writes for the Alex Now new publication. So, racial equity has been a really important topic in this school, and a lot of students and teachers feel like it still needs to be addressed for students and for staff to really know what it means to be a Black or brown student at TC. So Michael, what has the school been working on to ensure equity in the school system?
Well, you know, you'd like to think that we live in a post-racial society where people don't see color anymore, but sadly that's not quite the case. And there are sort of racial undertones to all kinds of ways that we live our lives. And you know, if you talk to people in a way where they can speak anonymously and their name is not attached to it and there's no repercussions for it, you learn that people view the world through a racial lens. You know, in fact, if you think about the school system and how it works, I learned a lot from your story, Bridgette, on racial equity and how the school system views this. There was one student that you talked to for your story, Michaela Pozo, who said, you know, if there's an African American student walking around and he or she doesn't have a pass, then a lot of times the administrators might assume that something is amiss or something is going wrong. But if a white student is walking around without a pass, well, that's fine. And so, you know, that's if the students feel like that's the case and that's the lens that they view the administrators, then, you know, there's a problem there, and then something needs to be done to address it. Now, what needs to be done to address it, of course, is a much thornier issue. However, just talking about it and recognizing the views is probably a good first step.
Yeah, and the article that I wrote for the Gazette Packet focused on this racial equity survey that was conducted in last school year, and they found a lot of inequities that existed between students and teachers and across school divisions on the elementary, middle, and high school level. And of course, these inequities have been observed by students, as you've said. So Missy, what role do students play in ensuring equity? Because, you know, they go to school here every day, and of course they experience the impacts of racial equity in this post-civil rights era.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think students play a major role. I think schools are all about the students. Lately, I feel like especially students have been major leaders in schools in all kinds of different initiatives. So I think equity is something where students definitely have a role to step up and kind of lead teachers and show them just how this era kind of works, especially millennials or younger kids are growing up where you're a lot more sensitive about things that are going on and being equal all around. So I feel like students can definitely lead this.
And Vernon, what racial inequities do you think still persist in education and in the city at large?
Well, racial inequities inside of the schools, I think we have to talk about not just addressing TC, not just addressing things in different schools, but addressing kind of overall the structure of the school system. I mean, we talked about the health department put out a 5-year study today that kind of charted the racial inequities throughout the school system, and they showed that even at a kindergarten level, you see it less with Black students at the kindergarten level, but more with Hispanic students at the kindergarten level, that there is an achievement gap even at the youngest possible age that they measure that. And it's showing that I think that there are like circumstances that go into it. These are like social and economic circumstances throughout the city, access to things like pre-K care and stuff like that. So you're gonna have to look at not just fixing the, you know, it's important to look at the hallway passes and stuff in a high school. It's important to look at the treatment of punishments, you know, inside of like the middle school level and stuff. But you also have to look at some of the broader issues as you address this and look at fixing some of the economic disparities that lead to that achievement gap.
And after this racial equity survey was looked at and conducted, the school division has considered restorative practices as a solution to fix these economic and social inequities that is occurring throughout our school district. So, Michael, what do you think will be the impact that this new racial restorative practices will have in classrooms and the way teachers teach?
Well, it has yet to be seen. You know, this restorative justice movement has been sort of building steam for quite some time, and I know that there's an advocacy group here in Alexandria, Tenants and Workers United, that has been working on this for many years. And they've been trying to instill these kinds of ways of thinking about conflict resolution across the city and also in the school system. And I don't know how much of that we've seen, actually, in the school
Community
system.
circles, actually. Community circles is an element of restorative practices, and you mentioned tenants and workers is working to not always resort to suspensions as a way of punishment, but, you know, conflict resolution and really hearing students out. So perhaps we might see that later on.
Perhaps. I mean, I think certainly a lot of these things should be tried. I mean, there's no downside in trying these sorts of things, and if they work, then that's great. If they don't work, maybe perhaps they can move on to something else.
Yeah, and I guess in this era now, we're kind of entering that time where we're moving away from suspensions and kind of seeing the inequities that they cause. So, Vernon, what do you make of this and the rise of restorative practices as potentially a new method of discipline?
Sure. I mean, I definitely think the restorative practices, they've been in the works for a while. I mean, for
Yeah.
years now, they've been studying for this and pushing for it. And
5 years.
Right, for 5 years. And I think there was some reluctance and a little bit of hesitation at the school administration level at first, but I really think over the years, the Tenants and Workers United, some of the students in this school have done a lot to kind of push generations and generations of the students coming through this school have been like fighting and like pushing for this. And that's been really helpful, I think, for this to really have kind of a grassroots appeal to it. But again, I mean, I think the only real solution for this is going to be eating the rich. That's kind of the, there's a certain feeling that there needs to be there needs to be some broader reforms and broader changes in the school system, more outside like support for some of these students. I think it's going to take restorative justice, restorative practices are a good start, but it's not the end goal post.
Definitely, and students are going to have a growing and more involved sense of presence in this racial equity process that the school division is undertaking, and Tenants and Workers United is partnering with the school division to develop a survey to better measure how students feel about the education they're receiving. So we'll see what becomes of that. So next we have the Virginia State Senate and House of Delegates elections that recently came out. And Michael, you've done a lot of reporting about the elections and voting, and what have you found to be unique about this recent election that has been different from others?
Well, the biggest thing is the Democrats are taking control, which they haven't been in control of the General Assembly since the late 1990s. And so most of those people are long gone. So you have a whole bunch of Democrats, and they're going to be in Richmond this year, who have no experience being chairman of a committee or being in charge of anything. And so, and you're going to have all of these legislative items that have been held up for many, many years. I think the most interesting thing to look at when you think about Democrats taking control is conflicts inside of the Democratic Party, because there are going to be like the progressive sort of liberal wing of the Democratic Party, then the more traditional business-friendly part of the Democratic Party, and that's where you're going to see the most interesting clashes on things like labor relations. Labor unions are going to want more power. The business part of that is not going to want to let them do that. There's also going to be campaign finance reform. There are going to be efforts to crack down on businesses making contributions to political candidates. And then you get to things like predatory lending. This is another thing where you're going to have a conflict inside of the Democratic Party, because there's all kinds of flavors of car title lenders or internet lenders or payday lenders. And so I think what you're going to see is the car title lenders are going to try to spread their power and influence using their campaign contributions at the expense of the other people in their industry. So you're going to see all of these clashes happening. And we're also going to have two Alexandria people are going to be like leading the Democrats. Senator Saslaw is an Alexandria senator. He's going to be in charge, basically, of the Senate. And Charnel Herring here in Alexandria is going to be the Democratic leader and the chairwoman of the Courts of Justice Committee, which is like one of the most important committees in the General Assembly. So it's going to be a heck of a year.
And Slaslaw and Herring both got reelected this time, right?
And they did.
Yeah, and I guess a question that I have is the fact that Democrats are in power and have both houses. Does this signal, Vernon, perhaps the end of bipartisanship in this district? You know, given that Republicans are out of power and have been for quite some time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know. A lot of it's going to depend on how some stuff goes with the presidential elections as well, and kind of in the coming years, you're going to look at the kind of the bigger picture and see how that affects Alexandria. But in terms of locally, yeah, I would say it's kind of there was one of the articles in one of the papers here recently had a RIP Alexandria Republicans, and they had this year as sort of the death date for the Alexandria Republican Party. And I think there's a certain legitimacy to that. There's, you have a handful of people who are out there waging independent campaigns largely, or waging a couple of startup Republicans. But by the most part, I think when you get around here, a lot of it's going to be a heavily Democratic majority. But like Michael Lee Pope pointed out here, you've got a lot of internal fighting for that as well. The CSO project, which is a big, expensive project, and I think going to be one of the big discussions coming up in the funding for the city. The city is asking for more funding for that project. I think they're asking for $75 million again this year. And I think a lot of people forget that the CSO project was put onto Alexandria partially from the influence from other Democrats from Fairfax. So that's not a necessarily bipartisan thing. It's not one thing, it's one party versus the other. And I think even though bipartisanship, Republican and Democrat, might be kind of at an end in Northern Virginia or in the state, I still think you're going to see factions emerging within the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and given these elections, voting amongst young people and millennials has been considerably low and has been for quite some time. So Missy, what do you take of this, being a younger person yourself, and the fact that, the 2020 elections are coming up and youth voting is more important now more than ever?
Mm-hmm. I think definitely in the 2020 election, we're going to see a lot of young people coming out just because it's almost impossible to ignore national politics, and presidential elections always have the biggest turnout. I'd say the challenge is getting people to come out for local and state elections. To be honest, before I started covering local news, I didn't realize how important local representation is, even if it's just your local city councilor, because the local decisions are the ones that are impacting your day-to-day life, whether it's a road reconstruction or anything else. That's the kind of thing where you have the biggest say. So I would just say all the kids out there, start paying attention to local politics, because that's really where it starts, and get out there and vote.
Yeah, that's a really good message for, high schoolers here and other young people who are looking to vote. And for our last topic, we have the school board, which also has its elections that people can vote in, and they're actually considering removing a couple seats from their current 9 members, which is a lot. Vernon, what do you make of this, and how might it impact local politics here?
Well, at the school board level, I think it's important to note that the reduction that they're talking about doing for the number of school board members would actually put it more in alignment with a lot of the school boards throughout Virginia. I think most of the school boards in Virginia have 5-member boards. I think there's a great article in the Alexandria Times by Missy about that, and bringing the Alexandria School Board back into kind of the widespread level of people in the school board. I think that would be a good thing for the board.
Oh, so you think that it'll be a good thing mostly because it'll be comparable to the rest of the state. However, there have been concerns that the school board reduction might result in issues with representation because we have 3 districts, and removing a couple will mean 7, and a couple might have 2 members and one might have 3. So Michael, how will it impact representation in this city and the districts?
One thing that's important to remember with the debate on the number of school board members is so we currently have 9. That seems like a lot. But there was a time back in the 1960s when there were 6 members of the Alexandria School Board. There were 6 white men who were members of the school board. And there was this is the time where they were trying to integrate the school system. And so what they decided to do was add 3 members specifically so they could put an African American on the school board. So the reason that we have 9 members is actually to increase African American representation on the school board. That's why there are 9 members. So, I mean, obviously the politics of integration are long ago in the past and sort of forgotten about. However, that concept of making sure there's all kinds of representation on the school board is still around, and perhaps even one of the strongest arguments for keeping the 9 members.
Yeah, and representation for the school board and in this district is obviously going to be something that is going to be continued to be discussed as the school board becomes more certain on how many people they're actually going to eliminate. And that's all that we have for today. I'm Bridgette Adu-Wadier, and these are my guests. I want to thank you all for coming. And this is another episode of Behind the Headlines. I ran out of time.